Ambassador Marcus Rodriguez stood in the pristine white briefing room of the Galactic Council headquarters, staring at a holographic display that showed what could generously be called his next assignment, or more accurately, his next death sentence. "Let me get this straight," Max said, crossing his arms over his rumpled diplomatic uniform. "You want me to negotiate peace with a species that has been at war for 500 years, has eaten every single diplomat you've sent, and considers violence a form of artistic expression?" Council Director Vex, a tall, spindly creature that looked like a praying mantis, had an unfortunate encounter with a filing cabinet, clicked his mandibles nervously. "Well, when you put it like that, Ambassador Rodriguez, it does sound rather challenging." "Challenging?" Mac barked out a laugh. "Director, I've had challenging assignments. Mediating the great toilet paper orientation war between the Zellans was challenging. This is what we call a suicide mission with extra steps." The hologram shifted to show footage of the Kronar homeworld. Massive reptilian creatures, easily 8 feet tall and covered in scales that looked like they could stop a plasma rifle, tore apart what remained of a diplomatic shuttle. Mac watched one of them casually toss a piece of twisted metal over his shoulder. "The Kronar warlords have rejected every attempt at communication," Vex continued, apparently oblivious to Mac's growing expression of disbelief. "They respond to all diplomatic overtures with what our xenobiologists believe is ritualistic consumption of the messenger." "Ritualistic consumption," Mac repeated slowly. "You mean they eat people?" "Well, yes, but it's cultural." Mac rubbed his temples, feeling a familiar headache building. At 52, he'd thought his days of dealing with impossible situations were behind him. He'd left his restaurant in Chicago specifically to avoid the kind of stress that came with people expecting miracles. Apparently, the universe had other plans. "And you're sending me because?" "Because you have an unusual background for a diplomat," Vex said, his voice taking on that overly cheerful tone bureaucrats used when they were about to ruin someone's day. "Your previous career as a chef gives you unique insights into cultural practices surrounding food and hospitality." "My previous career involved making sure drunk tourists didn't burn down my kitchen," Max said flatly. "The closest I got to diplomacy was convincing health inspectors that the green stuff was supposed to be that color. Nevertheless, the Council believes your unconventional approach might succeed where traditional diplomacy has failed." Mac looked at the hologram again. The Kronars were now using the remains of the diplomatic shuttle as toothpicks. "Let me guess. The traditional approach involved showing up, announcing you were there to talk peace, and then becoming the evening's entertainment?" "Essentially, yes." "And you think that because I can julienne vegetables and flambe desserts, I'll somehow convince a bunch of 8-foot lizard people to stop their 5-century-long war party?" Vex's mandibles clicked again. "The Kronar culture appears to place significant importance on food rituals. Perhaps your expertise could provide a different avenue of approach." Max stared at the alien bureaucrat for a long moment. "You know what the really scary part is? This actually makes sense to me, which probably means I've been doing this job too long." He sighed and straightened his jacket. "All right, Director, when do I leave for my appointment with the becoming reptile food?" "The transport departs in 6 hours. Oh, and Ambassador?" Vex's voice took on an almost apologetic tone. "The Council has prepared a standard will and testament form, just in case." "Wonderful," Mac muttered, heading for the door. "At least when they write my obituary, they can say I died doing something stupid for the good of galactic peace. My mother always said I'd amount to something." 6 hours later, Mac found himself standing on the bridge of a transport ship, watching the Kronar homeworld grow larger through the viewport. The planet looked like someone had taken Mars and decided it needed more teeth. Jagged mountain ranges carved the surface into territorial segments, and even from orbit he could see the smoke plumes from what the ship's captain cheerfully informed him were active battle zones. "Still time to turn around, Ambassador," Captain Torres said, not bothering to hide the worry in her voice. "No shame in calling this one a tactical retreat." "Tempting," Mac replied, adjusting his diplomatic sash one last time. "But I've got a reputation to maintain. Besides, how bad could it be?" The answer, as it turned out, was pretty bad. Mac's shuttle touched down in what the Kronar apparently considered neutral territory, which seemed to be defined as the place where only half the buildings are actively on fire. He stepped out onto the landing pad and was immediately greeted by the sight of 24 8-foot reptilian warriors arranged in what could generously be called a reception line, if receptions typically involved weapons that looked like they could level city blocks. At the head of the group stood the largest Kronar Mac had ever seen, which was saying something since this was his first time seeing any Kronars at all. The creature's scales were a deep bronze color, scarred from what were obviously countless battles, and his eyes held a kind of intelligence that suggested he was calculating exactly how much seasoning Mac would need. "I am Warlord Thrax of the Bloodclaw clan," the massive reptile rumbled, in surprisingly clear standard. "You are the latest sacrificial offering from the soft skins of the Galactic Council." "Actually," Mac said, stepping forward with more confidence than he felt, "I'm Ambassador Rodriguez, and I'm here to talk about ending your little war problem. Also, and I mean this, with all due respect, your victory feast setup is terrible." The assembled Kronars fell silent. Several of them looked confused, as if Mac had just started speaking in mathematical equations. Thrax's massive head tilted slightly. "Explain." Mac gestured at the crude stone platform behind the warlord, where a fire pit had been prepared and various sharp implements were laid out with all the finesse of a hardware store explosion. "Look, I get it. Traditional victory feast, honor the defeated enemy, probably some ceremonial significance I'm missing, but come on. You've got your heat source way too close to your prep area, your tools are just scattered around like a tornado hit a kitchen supply store, and don't get me started on the complete lack of proper seasoning stations." Thrax blinked slowly, which Mac was beginning to realize might be the Kronar equivalent of stunned silence. "You critique our sacred feast preparation?" another Kronar growled, stepping forward with what looked like a cross between a sword and a barbecue fork. "I'm not critiquing," Mac said quickly, then paused. "Actually, yes, I am totally critiquing. Look, if you're going to eat me, at least do it right. This setup wouldn't pass a health inspection on a backwater mining station." The Kronar with the sword fork thing looked ready to demonstrate its effectiveness, but Thrax held up a clawed hand. "You claim knowledge of feast preparation. Buddy, I spent 20 years running a restaurant in Chicago. Trust me, I've seen every possible way to turn raw ingredients into something edible, and some ways that definitely should not be attempted by anyone who values their continued existence." Mac walked over to the stone platform, ignoring the fact that several very large, very sharp weapons were now tracking his movement. He picked up what looked like a seasoning container and sniffed it. "Okay, first problem, this isn't seasoning, it's basically flavored sand. Second problem," he gestured at the fire pit, "you're trying to cook over an open flame with no temperature control. What are you, cavemen? And third," he held up a curved blade that was apparently supposed to be for carving, "this thing is duller than a council budget meeting. You couldn't cut butter with this, let alone properly portion your protein." The Kronars were now staring at him with expressions that Mac couldn't quite read, but he was pretty sure fell somewhere between fascination and homicidal rage. Thrax stepped closer, looming over Mac like a scaly mountain. "You would improve our sacred feast?" Mac looked up at the massive warlord, then at the circle of heavily armed reptilian warriors, then back at the pathetic excuse for a cooking setup. "Well," he said, "I mean, it couldn't get much worse." The silence that followed Mac's declaration was the kind that usually preceded either applause or executions. Given the circumstances, Mac was betting heavily on the latter. Then Thrax did something completely unexpected. He laughed. It wasn't a pleasant sound. It was like listening to gravel being processed through a cement mixer. But it was definitely laughter. The other Kronars looked as confused as Mac felt. "The soft skin mocks our traditions," Thrax rumbled, still chuckling in that disturbing way. "Either he is incredibly brave, or incredibly stupid." "I prefer to think of myself as pragmatically honest," Mac said. "Look, you want to eat me? Fine. That's your cultural thing, I get it. But wouldn't you rather eat something that actually tastes good? I mean, what's the point of a victory feast if the food is terrible?" Another Kronar, this one with distinctive red markings along his neck, stepped forward. "You claim you could do better, soft skin?" "I don't claim it," Mac said, his professional pride overriding his survival instincts. "I guarantee it. Give me proper tools and decent ingredients, and I'll show you what a real feast looks like." The Kronars began muttering among themselves in their native language, which sounded like rocks having an argument. Mac caught a few words that his translation implant rendered as either blasphemy or interesting, which in his experience were often the same thing. Thrax raised his hand for silence. "Very well, soft skin. A challenge. If you can prepare a feast worthy of warriors, we will hear your words of peace. If you fail," he made a gesture that needed no translation. "And if I succeed? Then you will have earned the right to speak before the clan council, though I warn you, they are much less easily impressed than I am." Mac looked around at the assembled warriors, all of whom looked like they could bench press a shuttlecraft. "Right, less easily impressed. Got it." 20 minutes later, Mac found himself in what the Kronars generously called a kitchen, but what looked more like a cave with delusions of grandeur. Stone surfaces, primitive fire pits, and cutting implements that belonged in a museum of medieval torture devices. Okay, Mac muttered to himself. I've worked with worse. Remember that place in Chinatown with the gas leak and the raccoon problem? This is just like that, but with more scales and fewer health violations. The ingredients, however, were a revelation. The Kronars might have had the culinary technique of particularly violent cavemen, but their food sources were incredible. Massive root vegetables with complex, earthy flavors. Fruits that tasted like they'd been designed by a committee of angels with excellent taste. And the meat? Dear Lord, Mac breathed, examining a cut from some local beast that looked like it had been crossbred with a tank. This marbling is perfect. You guys have been sitting on premium protein for centuries and you've been eating it like shoe leather. Thrax, who had insisted on observing the process, tilted his massive head. You speak strangely of food, soft skin. It is sustenance, nothing more. Oh, my friend, you are so very wrong. Mac began, examining the primitive knives, selecting the least awful ones. Food is culture. Food is community. Food is the thing that brings people together around a table instead of across a battlefield. Among my people, the battlefield is where we come together. Yeah, well, that's clearly been working out great for you, Mac said, beginning to work on the knives with a sharpening stone he'd found. 500 years of war, constant conflict, everybody angry all the time. Tell me, when was the last time you actually enjoyed a meal? Not just wolfed down some protein paste because you needed fuel, but actually sat down and savored something. Thrax was quiet for a long moment. Warriors do not savor, we consume. See? That's where you're wrong. Mac had gotten one of the knives to an acceptable sharpness and was now working on temperature control for the fire pit. Warriors need to savor more than anyone. You guys spend all day fighting for your lives. The least you can do is treat yourselves to a decent meal afterward. As Mac worked, something strange began to happen. Other Kronars started filtering into the kitchen area, drawn by smells they'd never experienced before. Mac had managed to create a makeshift seasoning blend from local herbs and was working on what he privately called alien beef Wellington, using the tank beast meat wrapped in layers of those perfect root vegetables. What is that aroma? Asked the red-marked Kronar from earlier, his nose twitching. That, Mac said proudly, is what happens when you treat good ingredients with respect. The meat is seared to lock in the juices, the vegetables are roasted to bring out their natural sugars, and those herbs you guys have been ignoring? They're working together to create something called flavor. Thrax leaned closer to the cooking area, his massive nostrils flaring. I have never smelled food like this. Because you've never had food like this, Mac said, beginning to plate the dishes with as much artistry as stone plates would allow. This is what happens when cooking becomes more than just making things edible. This is when it becomes art. The assembled Kronars watched in fascination as Mac added final touches to the presentation. He'd managed to create something that looked like it belonged in a 5-star restaurant, despite working in conditions that would have made a food truck owner weep. There, Mac said, stepping back from his masterpiece. The traditional victory feast, but done right. Who wants to try it? Every single Kronar in the room took a step backward. Mac blinked. Seriously? After all that, you're afraid to taste it? Thrax straightened to his full, imposing height. It is not fear, soft skin. It is respect. This is not mere food. This is something else entirely. Heh, yeah, Mac said with a grin. It's called good cooking. Now shut up and try it before it gets cold. Thrax was the first to move. The massive warlord approached Mac's creation like he was diffusing an explosive device, which, given Kronar cultural sensitivities, might not have been far from the truth. He picked up a piece of the perfectly seared meat with his claws, examined it carefully, then placed it in his mouth. His eyes widened immediately. By the great flame, he whispered, then took another bite, then another. Within moments he was consuming the entire portion with a fervor that bordered on religious experience. The other Kronars watched their leader with growing amazement, then one by one began trying the food themselves. The cave filled with sounds Mac had never heard before from any species, let alone one known for constant warfare. They were actually purring. This is unprecedented, said the red-marked Kronar, whose name Mac had learned was Skarg. In 5 centuries I have never tasted anything like this. 5 centuries? Mac blinked. Wait, how old are you guys? I am 637 years old, Thrax said between bites. Skarg here is approaching 700. We have been fighting since we were hatchlings. Mac stared at them. You're telling me you've been at war for your entire lives? Like, literally you've never known peace? Peace is for the weak, Skarg declared, though he said it while savoring another bite of Mac's cooking. The Bloodclaw clan has been at war with the Ironscale clan since the Great Dishonor. The what now? Thrax and Skarg exchanged glances. Mac noticed that both warriors suddenly looked uncomfortable, like teenagers who'd been caught doing something embarrassing. The Great Dishonor, Thrax repeated, but with noticeably less conviction. The terrible crime that started our righteous war. Okay, I'll bite, Mac said, sitting down on a stone ledge. What was this Great Dishonor? Did they steal your territory, destroy your sacred sites, kill your leaders? Another uncomfortable silence. Claimed ownership of the sacred recipe, Skarg finally muttered. Mac waited for more. When it didn't come, he prompted, And nothing, Thrax growled. That was the dishonor. They claimed the sacred recipe of the flame-kissed feast belonged to their clan, when clearly it was created by our ancestors. Mac looked between the two massive warriors, both of whom were suddenly very interested in examining their claws. Let me get this straight. You've been at war for 500 years over who invented a recipe. It was a very important recipe, Skarg said defensively. It was the recipe, Thrax corrected. The foundation of our entire culinary tradition. The dish that defined what it meant to be Kronar. Mac rubbed his temples, feeling that familiar headache returning. Okay, fine. What was this legendary dish that was worth half a millennium of warfare? Both warriors looked even more uncomfortable. Thrax cleared his throat. It was roasted beast haunch with ember root paste. Mac stared at them. That's it? Roasted meat with root vegetable paste? Seasoned with fire leaf, Skarg added weakly. Oh, seasoned, Mac said sarcastically. Well, that changes everything. No wonder you've been killing each other for centuries over who thought to put a leaf on some cooked meat. You do not understand, Thrax protested. This was not just food. This was culture. This was identity. When the Ironscale clan claimed they had created the dish first, they were claiming ownership of our very souls. And what evidence did they have? The heir elder grandmother remembered her great-great-grandmother making it. Mac turned to Skarg. And what evidence did you have? Our elder grandmother remembered her great-great-great-grandmother making it first. Two old ladies disagreed about a family recipe, and you decided the appropriate response was 5 centuries of warfare. When you say it like that, Thrax admitted, it sounds somewhat excessive. Somewhat excessive? Mac stood up, beginning to pace. Somewhat excessive? You've been slaughtering each other for 500 years over a disagreement that boils down to my grandma said so versus, well, my grandma said so first? Do you have any idea how insane that sounds? It was a matter of honor, Skarg said, but even he sounded uncertain now. Honor? Mac stopped pacing and stared at them. You want to know what's honorable? What's honorable is admitting that maybe, just maybe, 2 different people can come up with the same basic idea of putting meat and vegetables together over a fire. It's not exactly rocket science. The 2 Kronars exchanged another glance. Mac could practically see the gears turning in their ancient reptilian brains. But if we admit that, Thrax said slowly, then what have we been fighting for? Mac said, is exactly the right question. What have you been fighting for? Really? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been fighting because that's all you know how to do. The original reason got lost somewhere around year 50. And you've just been going through the motions ever since. Skarg set down his empty plate and looked at it thoughtfully. This meal you prepared, it is better than anything either clan has ever created. Of course it is, Mac said, because I didn't worry about who invented what or whose great-great-grandmother did it first. I just focused on making something good. And you know what? If you 2 clans had been sharing techniques instead of sharing battle scars for the last 5 centuries, you'd probably have figured out real cooking a long time ago. Thrax was quiet for a long moment. You suggest that we have been foolish? I suggest, Mac said carefully, that you've been human. Well, you know, Kronar. The point is, everybody gets caught up in old grudges sometimes. The trick is figuring out when it's time to let them go. But how? Skarg asked. How do we undo 5 centuries of tradition? How do we tell our warriors that everything they have fought for has been meaningless? Mac smiled, an idea beginning to form. Who says it has to be meaningless? You've got 500 years of culinary tradition here. 500 years of techniques, ingredients, methods that both clans have developed. Instead of fighting over who owns what, Why not celebrate what you've both created? The two Kronars stared at him blankly. I'm talking about a cookbook, Mac said. The definitive guide to Kronar cuisine, featuring recipes from both clans. Give credit where it's due, acknowledge the contributions of both sides, and turn your food culture into something that brings you together instead of driving you apart. Thrax and Skarg looked at each other, then back at Mac. A cookbook? Skarg said uncertainly. Cookbook, Mac confirmed. Trust me on this one. Food has a way of making everything better. 3 days later, Mac stood in the center of what had once been the primary battlefield between the Bloodclaw and Ironscale clans. The cratered wasteland had been transformed into something that looked like the galaxy's most dangerous cooking competition. Massive stone tables had been arranged in a circle, each one equipped with proper fire pits, actual seasoning stations, and cutting implements that Mac had personally sharpened to something approaching professional standards. I still cannot believe they agreed to this, Skarg muttered, adjusting the ceremonial cooking apron that Mac had insisted all participants wear. The sight of a 700-year-old reptilian warlord in a Kiss the Cook apron was something Mac was definitely going to remember for the rest of his life, however long that might be. Believe it, Mac said, surveying the organized chaos around them. When you've been fighting for 5 centuries, the idea of doing literally anything else starts to sound appealing. Representatives from both clans had gathered for what Mac was calling the Great Cook-Off of Cosmic Proportions, though the Kronars had insisted on translating it as the Trial of Flame and Flavor. Warriors who had been trying to kill each other just days before were now standing side by side, examining ingredients with the intensity they usually reserved for weapons inspections. Thrax approached, carrying what appeared to be a massive cleaver that looked like it could double as a shield. The Ironscale younglings are nervous, he reported. Many have never cooked alongside Bloodclaw warriors. The feeling is mutual, Skarg added, watching a group of his own clan members suspiciously eyeing a table of Ironscale spices. 600 years of warfare does not fade easily. That's exactly why this is going to work, Mac said confidently. Look around. What do you see? Both warlords looked around the transformed battlefield. Kronar warriors from opposing clans were tentatively sharing cooking space, passing ingredients back and forth, and occasionally offering technique suggestions to their former enemies. I see my people acting very strangely, Thrax observed. I see your people acting like people, Mac corrected. Watch that group over there. He pointed to a mixed team of Bloodclaw and Ironscale warriors who were collaborating on what appeared to be an elaborate soup preparation. That Bloodclaw warrior just showed an Ironscale how to properly bone a fish, and that Ironscale just shared her family's spice blend. This is Kala the Fierce, Skarg said, sounding amazed. She once single-handedly held the pass of Screaming Winds against 30 Bloodclaw warriors. I did not know she cooked. Everybody cooks, Mac said. Some people just don't know they cook yet. Motion near one of the central tables caught their attention. 2 warriors, one from each clan, were engaged in what appeared to be a heated argument over a cutting technique. Mac started forward, ready to intervene, but Thrax caught his arm. Wait, the massive warlord said. Listen. Mac paused and realized the 2 Kronars weren't arguing about the technique itself, but about the best way to apply it to their current ingredient. They were problem-solving together. Well, I'll be damned, Mac murmured. The cook-off continued for hours. Mac moved between the teams, offering advice, settling minor disputes, and generally trying to prevent any cooking accidents that might restart a 500-year war. But as the day progressed, something remarkable began to happen. The barriers between the clans started to dissolve. It began with small things. A Bloodclaw warrior complimenting an Ironscale warrior's knife work, an Ironscale elder sharing a technique her grandmother had taught her. Warriors who had been mortal enemies that morning were now debating the proper temperature for roasting ember root with the passion of Food Network judges. Mech, Thrax called out, you must see this. Mac hurried over to find the warlord standing beside a table where the 2 most senior warriors from each clan were working together on what appeared to be a masterpiece of culinary art. The dish combined elements from both traditional clan recipes, but elevated them with techniques Mac had taught and innovations the warriors had developed themselves. It is beautiful, Skarg said, his voice filled with something that might have been wonder. In all my centuries, I have never seen its equal. What are you calling it? Mac asked. The 4 elderly warriors looked at each other. Then one of the Ironscale elders spoke up. We have decided to name it the Treaty Feast, she said. because it represents what we can accomplish when we work together instead of against each other. Mac felt something suspiciously like moisture gathering in his eyes. That's perfect. As the sun began to set over the former battlefield, the teams presented their creations. Each dish was a fusion of both clan traditions, combining techniques and ingredients that had been developed in isolation for centuries. The results were extraordinary. I declare this competition to have no winners, Thrax announced formally, because we have all won. The assembled warriors cheered, a sound that echoed across the wasteland and probably confused the hell out of any wildlife in the area. Mac watched as natural enemies sat down together to share the fruits of their collaborative labor. You know, Skarg said, settling down beside Mac with a plate piled high with samples from every team, I am beginning to think this peace idea might actually work. It's not peace, Mac corrected, taking a bite of what he was pretty sure was going to be the best meal of his life. It's partnership. Peace is just what happens when partnership works. Around them, Kronar warriors from both clans were laughing, sharing stories, and comparing cooking techniques with the enthusiasm of old friends. The sight of former enemies bonding over properly seasoned ember root was something Mac was pretty sure had never happened in the history of galactic diplomacy. There is just one problem, Thrax said, though he was smiling as he said it. What's that? Now we will have to find something else to do with all our free time. 500 years of warfare is a hard habit to break. Mac grinned. Well, I hear cooking competitions can get pretty intense. Maybe you guys could start a galactic restaurant chain. Kronar cuisine, come for the food, stay because the chefs will eat you if you leave hungry. Skarg said thoughtfully, is not actually a terrible idea. As the celebration continued around them, Mac pulled out a small recording device and began documenting recipes, techniques, and stories from warriors of both clans. The Kronar cookbook was going to be something special. More than just a collection of recipes, it would be a testament to what could be accomplished when people chose to build bridges instead of walls. Or in this case, when they chose to build kitchens instead of battlefields. 6 months later, Mac sat in the same pristine white briefing room where his impossible mission had begun, staring across the table at Director Vex. The difference was that this time, he wasn't alone. Thrax and Skarg flanked him on either side, both wearing what Mac had learned were their formal, diplomatic armor, which still looked like they could level a small city, but with slightly more decorative elements. So let me understand this correctly, Vex said, his mandibles clicking in what Mac had learned was the alien equivalent of confused bewilderment. You negotiated a complete cessation of hostilities between two clans that have been at war for 5 centuries. Technically, Mac said, I negotiated a merger. They're not separate clans anymore. They're business partners. Business partners? The Kronar Culinary Collective, Thrax announced proudly. We have already received orders from 17 different star systems for our signature spice blends. And our cookbook, Skarg added, holding up a massive tome bound in what appeared to be reinforced leather, has been translated into 43 galactic languages. The Altarian Food Network wants to give us our own show. Vex stared at the cookbook like it might explode, which, given that it was written by formerly violent warlords, wasn't entirely unreasonable. A cookbook ended a 500-year war? Not just any cookbook, Max said, grinning. The definitive guide to Kronar cuisine, featuring 300 recipes developed over 5 centuries of, let's call it, competitive isolation. Plus techniques, cultural history, and a really entertaining chapter about how the whole war started over a disagreement about who invented barbecue. It was not barbecue, Thrax corrected. It was flame-kissed beast haunch. Which is barbecue, Mac replied patiently. We've been over this. The human insists on using primitive terminology, Skarg explained to Vex. But his understanding of flavor profiles is surprisingly sophisticated for a soft skin. I'm sitting right here, Mac pointed out. Director Vex picked up the cookbook with a kind of caution usually reserved for handling unstable explosives. And this has been commercially successful? Wildly successful, Mac confirmed. Turns out when you combine 5 centuries of culinary development with actual cooking techniques and a decent marketing strategy, you get something people want to buy. Who knew? The Zephyrian Empire placed an order for 10,000 copies, Thrax added. Apparently, they are having their own territorial disputes and hope our methods might provide inspiration. Your methods? Food-based conflict resolution, Mac explained. It's catching on. The Galactic Council has received 17 requests for similar diplomatic interventions. Apparently, Half the ongoing conflicts in this sector are really just cultural misunderstandings that could be solved over a good meal. Vex set the cookbook down and leaned back in his chair. Ambassador Rodriguez, when we sent you on this mission, we expected you to either succeed in traditional diplomatic negotiations or become a cautionary tale about the limits of human optimism, Max suggested. We did not expect you to revolutionize galactic diplomacy by teaching alien warlords to cook. To be fair, Max said, I didn't expect that either. I just figured if they were going to kill me anyway, I might as well critique their technique first. The human's arrogance was initially offensive, Thrax admitted, but his knowledge proved enlightening. He showed us that we had been thinking too small, Skarg added. For centuries, we focused on defeating our enemies. The humans showed us the value of converting them into customers. Mac laughed. I'm not sure that's exactly the lesson I was going for, but if it works, it works. Director Vex picked up another document from his desk. The Council has received a formal proposal from the Kronar Collective to establish a galactic restaurant chain, Warrior's Table, where every meal is a victory. Marketing isn't my strong suit, Mac admitted, but they insisted on keeping the warfare metaphors. Our target demographic appreciates aggressive advertising, Thrax explained. Speaking of which, Skarg said, turning to Mac, we have received approval for our expansion into the Vega system. We would like you to oversee the opening of our flagship restaurant. Mac raised an eyebrow. You want me to manage a restaurant run by former warlords? Think of it as continuing diplomatic relations, Thrax suggested, with better food and shorter hours than traditional warfare. Plus, Skarg added, the Altarian Food Network contract includes a significant signing bonus. We are prepared to offer you a partnership stake in the collective. Mac looked between the two massive reptilian entrepreneurs who had been trying to eat him less than a year ago. You know what? Why not? I've done stranger things. For galactic peace. Director Vex cleared his throat. Ambassador Rodriguez, the Council has another assignment for you. The crystalline hegemony and the plasma lords have been engaged in a resource dispute for the past century. Their conflict is beginning to destabilize the entire outer rim. Let me guess, Max said. You want me to teach them to cook? The preliminary reports suggest their conflict may have originated from competing claims about the proper preparation of energy-based nutrients. Max stared at the alien bureaucrat. They're fighting over how to cook energy? Apparently, the crystalline hegemony believes energy should be processed through harmonic resonance, while the plasma lords insist on direct thermal conversion. So they're fighting over cooking methods for food I can't even see, let alone taste. Will you accept the assignment? Mac looked at Thrax and Skarg, both of whom were grinning in that disturbing way that showed far too many teeth. Sounds like you will need consultants with experience in food-based conflict resolution, Thrax suggested. The Warrior's Table expansion can wait, Skarg agreed. This sounds more interesting. Mac sighed and stood up. Fine, but I'm going to need a bigger cookbook. As they left the briefing room, Mac couldn't help but smile. 6 months ago, he'd been a washed-up chef turned reluctant diplomat facing what seemed like certain death. Now, he was apparently the galaxy's leading expert in culinary diplomacy, with a best-selling cookbook and a restaurant chain run by reformed warlords. You know, he said to his unlikely business partners, when I left Chicago, I never imagined I'd end up solving interstellar conflicts with cooking lessons. The universe, Thrax observed, has a strange sense of humor. Yeah, Mac agreed, but at least the food's getting better. Behind them, Director Vex was already updating Mac's personnel file. Under special skills, he added, Xenocultural cuisine specialist, conflict resolution through competitive cooking, and somehow still alive despite everything. It wasn't the strangest entry in a diplomatic personnel file, but it was definitely in the top 10. And somewhere in the Vega system, construction crews were breaking ground on the first Warrior's Table restaurant, where the motto, come for the food, stay, because the chefs will eat you if you leave hungry, was already being carved into the entrance in 17 different languages. The galaxy, Mac reflected, was about to get a lot more interesting. And significantly better fed.